This is the third year for the PFAS Awareness Program, where UNA USA Kentucky Division, in partnership with sponsors and co-sponsors, focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 6 for clean water and sanitation, specifically by looking at PFAS forever chemicals. And tonight's program, again, is about PFAS, the per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, also called forever chemicals. And EPA finally became aware of scientific information linking PFAS to serious illnesses and cancers not long ago. And finally, we hear that EPA expects that over many years, their final rule, which was made only April this year, to set regulatory enforceable regulations for the first time on drinking water, will prevent PFAS exposure for approximately 110 million people and prevent thousands of deaths and reduce tens of thousands of serious PFAS attributable illnesses. However, drinking water companies get 5 years to come into compliance.
Well, we're very lucky and pleased to have this proclamation by Andy Beshear, Governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. To all whom these presents shall come, whereas per and polyfluoroalkyl chemicals, also known as forever chemicals or PFAS chemicals, are a group of man-made synthetic chemicals used in industrial and consumer products since 1940. And whereas nearly 14,000 derivatives exist today, which are useful in consumer products and manufacturing, which include, but are not limited to, fire extinguishing foam, food packaging, household products, and personal care products. And whereas the longevity of PFAS chemicals leads to accumulations in people, animals, and the environment over time, which increases the risk of harmful and serious illnesses and several types of cancers for adults, children, animals, and fish. And whereas working in occupations such as firefighting or chemical manufacturing and processing, consuming water or food contaminated with PFAS chemicals, or using products made with PFAS chemicals or products packaged with materials containing PFAS chemicals may increase the risk of exposure and bioaccumulation over time. And whereas children may be at risk of higher exposure to PFAS chemicals because they drink more water, eat more food, and breathe more air per pound of body weight than adults. And whereas research being conducted to measure the harmful effects of exposure to PFAS chemicals has shown that it may lead to decreased fertility or infertility, developmental effects or delays in children, increased risk of some cancers, reduced capability of the immune system, and interference with natural hormones. And whereas looking at more recent scientific evidence has led to the EPA to state there is really no safe level of PFAS, the Kentucky Department of Energy and Environment is working on PFAS as its number one priority to protect the health of Kentuckians. Now, therefore, I, Andy Beshear, Governor of the Commonwealth of Kentucky, do hereby proclaim October 28, 2024 as PFAS Chemical Awareness Day.
I'd like to present two proclamations. The first one reads, Craig Greenberg, Mayor, greetings to all whom these presents shall come. Know ye that October 28, 2024 is hereby proclaimed in Louisville, Kentucky to be United Nations Day, and I urge all residents to observe this special recognition. So, where's that?
Yes, to Dr. J. Dr. J. Christopher States, if you could come forward, and we'd like for you to stay here a minute while Samita gives this to you, this proclamation. And while I let everyone know who you are, that you're with the U of L Christina Lee Brown Environmental Institute, and you are the director of U of L Center for Integrative Environmental Health Sciences, or CIEHS for short. And also Professor States is vice chair for research and interim vice dean for research in the Department of Pharmacology and Toxicology. We do have an additional award for you in honor of PFAS research being done and overseen by you. We are presenting the 2024 PFAS Awareness Award, We want to thank you for all you have been doing and are continuing to do to help with PFAS. And give me just a minute to get that.
I'll hand you the proclamation in the meantime. Thank you.
Can you reach it?
Greetings to all whom these presents shall come. Know ye that October 28, 2024 is hereby proclaimed in Louisville, Kentucky to be PFAS Day, and I urge all residents to observe this special recognition.
PFAS Day, something I thought I would never see happen in my lifetime, that we would all be here talking about this, let alone in the context of a UN day and in Kentucky, recognizing not only that this chemical exists, but it's something we all ought to be responding to. And it's taken us a long time to get here. I started my legal career 34 years ago. I'm feeling very old when I say that anymore. And about 25 years of that have been focused on these chemicals, these PFAS forever chemicals, these completely man-made chemicals that never existed on the planet prior to World War II, but during all of our lifetimes have been used in massive quantities and pumped into so many different products that we all use all over the planet. Pretty much anything that's non-stick, stain-resistant, grease-proof, waterproof, Teflon, Scotch Guard, you name it. That this stuff is now permeating the entire planet. It's in our water, in our soil, in our air, in virtually every living creature on the planet, including the blood of about 99.9% of the people on this planet. Children are now born pre-polluted with these chemicals. So we're now, I think, all finally waking up to what is a massive, really unprecedented public health threat. And I first got involved in all this about 25 years ago when a farmer right up the Ohio River here outside of Parkersburg came to me trying to figure out why his cows were all dropping dead after this white foaming water was coming out of a nearby landfill. And when we agreed to take that case on back in October of 98, all right, 1998, that led to what has now become non-stop litigation over the last 25 years against the makers of these chemicals. Companies like DuPont, 3M, now some new created companies like Chemours and others that created these chemicals and unfortunately understood very soon after they started making them, decades ago, that these chemicals were toxic, persistent, meaning they'd get out there and stay in living things, bioaccumulative, that they would, if they got out into the environment, these things would never break down, right? Which is why we now all talk about them as forever chemicals. These things may take millions of years to begin breaking down and disappearing off the planet. So digging through all of these documents, we only found out about this because of the farmer named Mr. Tennant in West Virginia, who first came saying, hey, this shouldn't be happening, all right? What's getting into the water here? And it was when we started that case and were able to start getting into all of these documents that these companies had, that we even found out these chemicals existed. And by that point, this is the late 1990s, early 2000s. So I began forwarding all that information to every regulatory agency I could think of at the time. The US EPA, the state agencies, the Department of Justice, and kind of naively assuming they were going to jump in and fix all of this, all right? And the first letter I sent was in March of 2001. And as you heard a little earlier here, the US EPA just established the very first enforceable drinking water standard for this chemical that we were dealing with just a couple of months ago, all right? So why did this take so long? Because what we found out was this was all covered up. right? This information that these companies had access to wasn't shared with the public, wasn't shared with the government regulators, wasn't shared with the scientific community. And it took us fighting through court for decades to finally start getting that information out to the rest of the world. And once we did, that's when the regulatory authorities were able to start this process to begin regulating these. And what you just saw happen here, again, once the science was finally made available, we still had to fight because the companies were saying, that's not enough, there's not enough data. And as you saw, we had to do massive new studies that were done, tens of thousands of people participated. All of that data was turned over. The agencies finally were able to start the process to begin regulating these. And what we finally got were the very first drinking water standards for a couple of these chemicals, all right? And declaring them hazardous under the federal law. And while all of that is happening, and keep in mind that took decades to get to that point, what we've been focusing on is this stuff being in the drinking water, all right? And in the meantime, as we've been learning about this, we realized this stuff wasn't just in the water up the river and outside of Parkersburg. This stuff is being found in the drinking water all over the United States, all over the world. And what we've now realized is these chemicals, again, they're in the water. They're above levels that the regulators are saying of concern. What are those levels now? The US EPA is essentially saying, if you can detect them at the analytical levels of around 4 parts per trillion, we're concerned, all right? So incredibly low levels. And what's happening? All of our water providers, municipalities, cities, water companies, are suddenly forced with the costs of how we get this out of the water. This is going to be incredibly expensive. And they're not the ones who put it in the water. These companies who created these things, knowing this, did. So what's happened is there's been a whole new slate of litigation over the last several years to try to recover the costs and make sure that the people who actually created the problem are held responsible. Not all of us, the victims. And I'm happy to say, just last summer, we were about ready to take the very first case to trial for water contamination across the country when these companies finally started to agree to settle. We reached the largest settlements in US history last summer for drinking water providers, over $14 billion by 3M, DuPont, Chemours, the makers of these chemicals. But all of this, again, has been focusing on the drinking water, right? And unfortunately, what we've learned now is this isn't just in the water. People have been exposed to it in other ways, particularly folks like firefighters, all right? Firefighters have realized these chemicals weren't just used in Teflon or Scotchgard. There was one product in particular that they used them in very high concentrations, and that was a type of firefighting foam called aqueous film forming foam. It's a type of firefighting foam that every airport, fire station, military base, all over the planet has been using since the Vietnam War era to put out petroleum-based fires. And how are you told to use that stuff? Spray it out all over the ground. So that stuff has been sprayed out all over the country, all over the world. And unfortunately, that's resulted in not only drinking water contamination like we've been talking about, but exposure to the firefighters, to the military personnel. The firefighters and military personnel didn't know they were exposed. So as we started to realize this additional level of exposure, one of the things we realized was all of this story we've been talking about here, most of it, again, not only was it covered up, but even as we started to alert the regulators and the scientific community, the public still didn't understand this was happening. And even when they realized it was happening maybe up the river, well, not over here in the other parts of the country. So that's when Mark Ruffalo reached out after this article we were talking about in 2016 and said, how do we get this story out to the rest of the world? How do we raise people's awareness that this is likely impacting all of us? Which led to the idea of a film, Dark Waters, which came out in 2019. Then when this issue with the firefighters came up, we're able to team up with amazing filmmakers that are here in the room, right, to help put together a film to help alert the firefighting community called Burned. And these amazing filmmakers were able to help bring that story out to hundreds of fire stations. Now, and I'll stop talking because I think we want to get to these films, is one of the things we've also learned is not only do we have these chemicals that have gotten into the water that we used to use in making Teflon and firefighting foam and Scotchgard, but when we finally got that story out and regulators started to finally address that, and these chemicals started to be finally phased out here in the US, the chemical makers tweaked them a little bit. All right? They started changing the formula just ever so slightly so that the chemical was now a new chemical with a new name. For example, the chemical that had been used to make Teflon for decades up the Ohio River, called PFOA, had 8 carbons attached to fluorine, C8. The company, when it finally agreed to phase that one out because the story came out through Dark Waters and other events, they simply took 2 carbons off. Instead of making C8, they started making C6, renamed it Gen X, started making it at a plant down in North Carolina. That's what got shipped up to the plant here in West Virginia and got into the Ohio River and starts going all over the world. And suddenly people start to realize it's not just a couple of these chemicals. And as you heard, there could be 14,000 of these related chemicals. And so how do we bring that story out? And so again, the power of film, I think, has been incredible in bringing this story out to the world. And we are incredibly fortunate, I think, to have here tonight some filmmakers who are going to help bring that story about these related chemicals, what's been happening in North Carolina that most of the world still doesn't know about. But we're starting, and we want to make sure that we all don't repeat this story over and over again, that we learn from what happened with these chemicals. And when we start to see these things being tweaked and the story repeating itself in other communities like in North Carolina and other places around the world, we don't just see this pattern repeat. So I think we're incredibly fortunate to have folks here tonight who are going to help bring that story out through this film on Gen X. And so I don't want us to talk any longer because I want us to get to that so we can look at that. But thank you so much for having this event, because this is what we need to do. Talk about these issues, engage the public, help spread this story as far as we can. Thank you.
It's really an honor to follow Rob to talk about this, because the past 7 years of my life have basically been dedicated to this issue. So in the interest of time, I'll try to be concise. I'll try not to ramble. I'll just explain why this is, because 7 years ago, I was a pre-medical student at UNC thinking like I was just going to be a doctor. And I was in that position because, probably like some of the folks in this room, someone very close to me had a rare and incurable disease. It was actually my mom. She became sick kind of spontaneously when I was a teenager because she had this, as we learned, rare autoimmune disease. And it's really hard, I think, when any of us deal with illness, but it's especially hard when there's no solution. And I remember thinking, well, maybe I could get involved in medicine and public health to fix that, because I think as people in society, like especially in medicine, we always want to try to solve problems, right? We want to actually deal with them at their root. We don't want to just take drugs for the rest of our lives, right? And so that was my motivation 7 years ago, and I learned a whole lot about how bodies work, how chemistry works. And I was planning to roll into graduate school when in 2017, which was 7 years ago, there was some really big news where I grew up, which is in North Carolina. And that was, like many places across this country, when all of a sudden it shows up that there were several very scary sounding chemicals suddenly detected in the drinking water. The name that was popular in North Carolina was this Gen X chemical. It was kind of like a buzzword phrase. It was something that people could say versus like really long chemical names like perfluorooctanoic acid or something horrible like that. And it was really critical timing. You know, I'm about to go into med school. I've taken all this chemistry work. I can kind of dive into the science. And it was friends actually back home who said, hey, Eli, I don't understand this. Can you translate? What are these perfluorinated? I don't know what these are. And so I decided, okay, well, let me take a deeper dive. And I'm really, really grateful that just a year earlier, the work that Rob had been doing basically in secret for so many years to uncover information about PFAS, as we now know them, had just come to light. There was a big expose in the New York Times about forever chemicals, which we had just started to call them. And it was really this work that Rob had been doing in all of the corporate documents that the DuPont company and the 3M company had basically kept from the public for literal decades. And so it was just this really fantastic timing that I could say, all right, because I have a background in chemistry, because I can sort of do this cross-reference, I could dig in and say, okay, wow, so these chemicals that have just shown up in our drinking water and that have been there for decades seem really bad. You know, based on what I knew from organic chemistry labs, these were toxic, these were scary, we should be getting these out right now. But that's not how the public saw it. There was a lot of uncertainty, there was a lot of vagueness, there was a lot of, these are just unusual chemicals, I don't know if they're bad. And so that's what started us on this journey that's taken 7 years of, okay, how can we make this make sense to people? What's the big picture here? The big picture that we know now is that PFAS, I'm just gonna define it in a very accessible way. Forever chemicals, I think this is a better term, is a family or a class of chemicals. It really just refers to a genre or type of chemical, okay? There's technically an infinite number. But they all have these unique qualities that are the reason that they kind of last forever. This is why we call them forever chemicals. Sammy, if you could help them navigate to the PFAS 101 page. We've made it simple because as Rob's really legacy of work have shown us, this is a global issue. And one of the things that is important is to sort of see what is the big picture. From a chemistry perspective, this is why we care about PFAS. There are 3 things that they all have in common. They are persistent, which is why we call them forever chemicals. Unlike basically any other pollutant, like if you get an oil spill, eventually it breaks down. These do not. They will last for tens of thousands of years. They literally last longer than any generation of people ever could. Number 2, they are prevalent. They are found everywhere. As Rob was saying, there's basically no body of water on the planet that is free of forever chemicals. This is why they are so important to us as a species. And number 3, they are poisonous. And another way to phrase that is to say they are toxic. They are associated with a wide range of health effects. And not just things that are kind of known now, like cancer. They are associated with many forms of cancer. But things like autoimmunity and changes to the ways that our health works. And so the main picture that I think Rob's work is starting to build towards, and I think why, because this is a lot of scary stuff, and I feel like I want to make sure we're not in Bummer Town right now. This is a joke we make a lot. This is a hard topic to talk about, but one of the coolest things that I've seen in the 7 years that I've worked on this, which is really not that long of a time. I mean, Rob has committed for so long, and I really appreciate him for it, because the trend is shifting so positively for this issue. We're really seeing a groundswell of change. I'll actually make this really amazing nod of hope, which is that really this whole industry began because the DuPont company and the 3M company in the 30s and 40s and 50s decided we can make a lot of money by selling these in lots of different products, and maybe we just don't tell people that we know that they might be dangerous. Now, even though these companies have made lots of money, billions, trillions of dollars, and even though there's not been yet any government mandate, and there are a lot of lawsuits, but none of them have required this, the 3M company, so one of these two, has made they made this announcement just a few years ago, that they are voluntarily withdrawing from this whole industry. They're not swapping to some other PFAS that's probably also dangerous. They are completely pulling out of this chemistry. And it's not because they are required to do so. I think it's because they realize they are losing. And I think we should take a minute to applaud that, because that's amazing. I would liken this to being as if Shell told us tomorrow they're going to be a solar company. You know, it really is that hopeful. So, okay, if we can go back to the main page really quickly. I know some folks came to see some clips, and so we're going to make sure to show one thing, because really the goal with this project has been, it started as an effort to help my city of Wilmington, North Carolina, basically to understand how is it that there was 40 years of contamination in our drinking water that harmed all of us, and it wasn't discussed. How could that be? Working on it for so long, I realized this is a global issue. This is interconnected. How can we kind of look at the bigger picture of this? And so it's going to, this project is done, it's being edited, and will be released very soon next year as a 4-part mini-series on sort of that whole history. And so we will see a fun little demo of that later. But I will just make one more nod to something that I found to be amazing, and hopefully we can all leave this room feeling empowered by our abilities, which is the real power of action by just telling a story, by just talking to people. And that was, Rob mentioned this, we produced a documentary just this past year called Burned, basically as an offshoot of this effort, because we were in the room with the right people to discover that the clothing that every firefighter wears and has worn since the 1980s, the thing that we would recognize a firefighter for, right, their turnout gear as they call it, has contained huge amounts of PFAS literally in all of the layers of the clothing, and it's been basically this direct correlation of disproportionate rates of cancer and cardiovascular disease among firefighters globally. And you know, it was really nice timing for us that we were able to work with the community activist who did all this work. It looks like we've got the trailer. We actually have this whole film that folks can access for free on YouTube anytime that they want and see the story. But this all came about because there was just a community activist whose husband was diagnosed with cancer as a career firefighter, who decided to do a lot of digging on her own, basically do her own research, and partnered with some amazing scientists to prove that firefighters are being exposed through their clothing, and if she could just get this communication out to firefighters in a way that they would listen, maybe we could change this. The burden needs to be on those who make a new thing to prove definitively that it is safe before they can release it, and that's called the precautionary principle. So yes, you're 100% spot on, and that's 100% what the story will be telling people.
But as mentioned, my training's in environmental epidemiology, and my research focuses on identifying the impacts of different types of environmental chemicals, such as PFAS and other toxicants, on maternal and child health. And so to start, I wanted to provide some historical context surrounding this research topic. And the knowledge that PFAS might be harmful to maternal and child health is not new. And recently, a group of researchers conducted an analysis of internal 3M and DuPont documents dating back from 1961 to 2006 to establish a timeline for when these companies produced internal knowledge about the potential harmful effects of PFAS. And they compared it to the scientific research knowledge in the public domain. These documents were gathered through litigation, discovery by Rob here, and they conducted this analysis in order to understand the consequential delays in details about health effects of PFAS coming to light. And so this figure here, hopefully you can read some of the text, outlines the timing of these findings, and the orange boxes represent findings that were generated by industry research, while the blue boxes represent findings from non-industry research. Above the timeline are the papers that were in the public domain, and below the timeline is information that was in the private domain within the industry's communications and their own research. Specifically, I want to highlight the timeline for research and knowledge related to maternal and child health. So in 1981, you can see there, DuPont learned that some pregnant workers suffered miscarriages while others delivered infants that were born with birth defects that were previously found in animals in their research. However, at the time, they released employee communications denying that exposure was linked to adverse pregnancy outcomes. They also did not share these details externally at the time. Research and information linking PFAS with birth defects was not reported in the medical literature and public domain until more than 30 years after these companies knew about it. Throughout this period, this analysis of these documents found that 3M and DuPont used strategies commonly deployed in other industrial sectors, such as tobacco, to influence science and regulatory policy that shape public health. Internal documents suggest that they primarily attempted to suppress these favorable research and not publish any evidence of harm. So meanwhile, during this suppression of evidence that PFAS may pose a risk to maternal and child health, PFAS were widely added to products due to many of the properties that we've heard mentioned here tonight. And they were also released directly into the environment, as we've heard here also. And as a result, research suggests that almost all pregnant women in the US have detectable levels of PFAS in their blood. And exposure occurs from food packaging, personal care product use, household goods, nonstick pans, and more. And we've discussed this as well earlier. And at this point, there are thousands of PFAS with different chemical structures and unknown health effects that are often not mentioned in the ingredients list or labels for these products. These PFAS can be regularly released from products and they enter the body. And once PFAS enters a pregnant person's body, it can pass through the placenta to the developing fetus, which internal documents suggest that this is something that DuPont was aware of in the 1980s. And then after the child is born, the PFAS can also pass from the mother to the child through breast milk. The child gets this double dose of PFAS from both the mother as well as their own exposure through use of these other products as well. So while PFAS were allowed to proliferate in the products and environment, it has become increasingly difficult to fully understand the impacts of these exposures on public health. Much of the early research on this topic focused on identifying the health effects after occupational exposures or among communities with high levels in the environment and drinking water. And these studies really provide a critical foundation of knowledge about the health effects of PFAS. However, the amount of exposure in these scenarios could be much higher than exposure levels experienced by other people in the US through routine activities. And the source of PFAS exposure, the type of PFAS exposure, and the intensity of exposures can change how PFAS impact health over time. So therefore, public health researchers still have a lot of work to do to understand how continuous exposure throughout activities every day impacts maternal and child health over time in the general population. So I wanted to highlight some relatively newer findings from some recent public health research that has focused on understanding how exposure to PFAS throughout pregnancy, infancy, and childhood can have lifelong impacts on health. And so we think that exposure to PFAS during fetal development and infancy could be particularly harmful for health because it is a time of rapid growth and biological changes that are critical for optimal physiological functioning once this child reaches adulthood. And there's an understanding in this field that infants and child aren't just little adults, and for a number of biological reasons, environmental exposures to chemicals such as PFAS could have more significant impacts on children's health compared with adults. In public health research, we can study longer-term health effects of PFAS using pregnancy and birth cohorts, and these are studies where we recruit pregnant women and conduct study visits with them during pregnancy, as well as throughout childhood after birth. We document these PFAS exposures and look at different health effects through clinical visits that are repeated over time. So through these studies, there's been some evidence emerging to suggest that higher exposure to some PFAS during pregnancy may be associated with things like lower birth weight, shorter birth length, as well as smaller head circumference among infants. These are indicators of poor fetal development, and low birth weight has been linked with higher risk of chronic disease in adulthood. Recent research also suggests that prenatal exposure may be also related to poor immune response to vaccines in childhood. For example, higher levels of some PFAS during pregnancy have been associated with lower levels of antibodies for diseases like rubella after vaccination in children. And higher levels of PFAS have also been linked to more frequent colds, as well as stomach bugs during childhood. Furthermore, emerging evidence indicates that exposures could be related to adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes, with evidence linking early life exposure to lower IQ in children, as well as poorer executive function and more behavioral problems. So now accumulating evidence is also starting to focus on the impacts of early life exposures on health during adolescence. And adolescence, which starts around puberty, is a critical period of development. And research suggests that health conditions and lifestyle factors that are established during this period can impact disease risk in adulthood. For example, research suggests that adolescents who have poorer cardiovascular and metabolic health tend to have higher risk of cardiovascular disease in adulthood. And because available evidence is suggesting potential associations between some PFAS and type 2 diabetes, dyslipidemia, and blood pressure in adults, there's this need to understand how these adverse health conditions start to develop earlier in a person's life so that we can identify how we may intervene and prevent chronic disease. And new research indicates that some of these effects of PFAS may be emerging earlier in adolescence. For example, newer research has linked early life exposure to some PFAS with unfavorable cardiometabolic risk during adolescence. And this figures from a recent study by Lee et al. From Brown University, and they found that higher concentrations of some PFAS during pregnancy were associated with higher cardiometabolic risk when children were around 12 years. In this study, cardiometabolic risk was characterized by elevated abdominal obesity, dyslipidemia, disrupted glucose and insulin metabolism, as well as high blood pressure. And all these are increased risk for cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes in adulthood. Another study conducted by Buckley et al. Reported that higher exposure to some PFAS during early life was linked to lower bone mineral accrual and strength when adolescents were around 12 years. And this figure shows that higher concentrations of some of these PFAS were associated with lower bone mineral content, specifically in the hip and forearm areas. And bone mass in adolescents impacts risk for fractures when they're kids playing sports, as well as influences the peak bone mass that an individual will have in early adulthood, and then their risk for developing osteoporosis later in life. So therefore, achieving optimal bone accrual during adolescence is really important for later life bone health. So in both of these analyses, the researchers looked at the effects of single PFAS at a time. However, we know in the real world, people are exposed to mixtures of thousands of these chemicals at a time. And we think that when multiple PFAS have similar biological impacts, that there's the potential for these PFAS mixtures to have even larger combined impacts on health. So ongoing research is really focused on understanding these impacts of mixtures of these thousands of PFAS, as well as the impacts of newer PFAS on children's health. So altogether, this body of historical and emerging research suggests that PFAS at exposure levels observed among the general population may impact how children grow, behave, as well as increase their risk of infections and chronic diseases. So those were just a few slides, a few areas I wanted to highlight related to recent research on the health impacts among the offspring, but I also wanted to briefly mention research that is focusing on understanding the impacts of PFAS exposures during pregnancy on the pregnant person. During pregnancy, there are drastic physiological changes, such as increase in the size of the maternal heart and blood volume to accommodate the growing fetus. And PFAS may also impact these processes to have impacts on the health of the mother both during and after pregnancy. So some emerging research suggests that exposure to some PFAS may be associated with higher risk of gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, and gestational hypertension. And these health conditions can obviously have impacts on birth outcomes, but they can also be linked to increased maternal cardiovascular disease risk after pregnancy. So ongoing research is focused on better understanding these risks, which is a critical area to explore given that there are higher rates of maternal morbidity and mortality in the US that are linked to these conditions. So I just wanted to conclude with a slide on action items. Hopefully through this presentation and all of the discussion tonight, it is clear that PFAS are a global problem that requires a national policy and regulatory response in order to adequately protect human health. However, in the meantime, some individuals may wonder if there are steps they can take to reduce their own exposure. And here's a figure with 10 suggestions to avoid PFAS, as well as other chemicals and toxicants that are found in the environment. And these exposures have been found to have similar effects for pregnant people and their child. Actions such as avoiding processed foods and instead eating fresh foods, cooking with cast iron instead of nonstick pans, and using water and vinegar to clean around the home may be particularly effective at reducing PFAS exposures. However, it will not be an effective public health approach to rely solely on these individual actions to reduce exposure. So it is really important to think about things like putting pressure on companies to remove PFAS from products and supporting policies that would limit PFAS exposures. And these actions are absolutely critical to addressing the issue of the impact of PFAS on health in the general population.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this opportunity given me, and I'm excited to share with you on this very, I would say, critical and yet complex subject. And I hope to break it down with you so that at the end of this talk, I would have been able to enlighten your understanding about this concept. I want to start with an analogy. Imagine a room filled with all kinds of people and a tiger invades that room. In this room, there are children, there are youthful people, there are adults, there are elderly, and all these people do have their various forms of vulnerabilities. Some who are young could gather something in an attempt to crush the tiger's head, whereas some might even freeze, and might fall victims to the prowess of the tiger. Now, to deal with a tiger in this context, a lot of careful approach models must be taken into consideration. Now, first is we need to identify who this threat is. What are kind of the features that make this threat very demanding of attention? The fact that if you don't do something now, there is problem on hand. Again, we need to identify the various levels of vulnerabilities. As I did indicate earlier, we do have old people, we do have people with underlying ailments, we do have children or babies, nursing mothers, so many people, to name but a few. And also, we need to carefully plan to bring this tiger under control. And these are related to several strategic approaches. And so, what if this tiger that I'm talking about is actually a metaphor just to explain the context, but in effect, the tiger represents the numerous environmental pollutants that we see in our communities, just as I've been talked about 25 years ago when the PFAS issues were going on. The C8 project was established to investigate and all that. And so with this understanding, I would want to just walk you through, but I believe that a lot of things that I have on my slides have already been very well discussed this evening. And so looking at the time, I don't want to keep you sitting for that long. I'll just flip through some of my slides. But tonight, I want to establish the point that the reality of PFAS in our communities is something that is very worrying, and we need to really pay greater attention to the fact that PFAS has got to do with a lot of impact on health effects, and recently we are seeing that even our lifestyle patterns could determine how severe these effects could ensue on human lives. And so, most of these have been already talked about. The levels of PFAS in our water bodies, as far as the U.S. is concerned. The uses of PFAS, they've all been touched on, how PFAS get into the environment, how they get exposed to the underground waters, and several releases from industrial companies polluting the environment, and wastewater cycle systems are also affected. Health effects has also been touched on very well, and so I wouldn't spend much time on that. Just a few snippets of PFAS in the news recently. There was in the news that forever chemicals show up in our food, clothes, and home. CNN reported that nearly half of the tap water in the US is contaminated with forever chemicals. And again, there was this caption which says that a forever chemical contaminates drinking water near military bases. And very recently, scientists have also discovered forever chemicals in bottled water. So that's very worrying. Well, just as have already been touched on, in April, the U.S. government, the U.S. EPA was able to pass the first regulation regards to PFAS in drinking water. And they use about 6 of the legacy PFAS compounds. So let me bring you in context to what I want to share, very little story I want to share with you tonight. Our lifestyle, together with the exposure of PFAS, how does it yield the overall health outcome as far as human lives are concerned? Our lifestyle, nutrition, physical activity, sleep or rest, smoking, tobacco use, and alcohol consumption. What happens, as I've shown previously and as I've been touched on, we know that exposure to PFAS constitutes a greater leverage of detrimental health effects. But what is not clearly known in literature, which is kind of burgeoning as a research concept, is how our lifestyle could intersect with these PFAS exposures in the environment and expand the scope of, or magnify the scope of disease influences as far as human lives are concerned. And so I want to show you one study related to the consumption of high-fat diet food together with PFAS, which was conducted in Rhode Island University, and it showed that mice that received both a high-fat diet with in conjunction with PFAS exposure had neurodevelopmental problems. Secondly, researchers in University of Illinois also established the fact that PFAS exposure in context of high-fat diet consumption also led to increased prostate cancer prognosis. Now, in our university, in the CAVE lab, my PI, Dr. Cave, is here. So in our lab, we've developed a model to study another level of lifestyle pattern, which is alcohol consumption, together with PFAS, and see how that results in disease-modifying mechanisms. And so that's what I've been working on in the CAVE lab. And so just to give you a snippet of what we've seen from our ongoing research. So far, we've seen that when you expose PFAS together with alcohol consumption, you realize that most of the PFAS are built up in the liver. Again, PFAS exposure also made the liver store more fat when the mice consumed alcohol. And then again, the exposure to PFAS made alcohol-related liver damage and toxicity very worse. And then the enzyme ALT, which is a marker of liver injury, was highly increased in mice which consumed alcohol and at the same time were exposed to PFAS. PFAS exposure also sped up the breakdown of alcohol in the body, and this led to an overall state of toxic effect as well. And then last but not least here, PFAS exposure activated several metabolic pathways in the body, thereby even complicating the pathways towards this toxicity status. So I think, yeah. So what are the next steps we should take? I want to say that we need to adjust some of our, whilst research is still evolving, we need to adjust some of our lifestyle activities. We need to avoid intake of high-fat diet or fat-rich diet in excess amount. We need to engage in regular physical activities, limit alcohol consumption, and also stay informed about PFAS research and development. We need to spread the awareness, just as have been discussed tonight, about the detrimental effect that PFAS has on the human body, and then as a living organism, how PFAS end up destroying a lot of things. Now, I'll end up by saying that the tiger, which the metaphor of a tiger that I used previously, depicting PFAS exposure, still exists in our environment, and we are bound to face this tiger every now and then. And so we need to take action now. We need to stay alert and work together to tame this tiger in the environment. To this end, I would like to say a big thank you to my mentor, Dr. Matthew Cave, and other collaborators. And I mean, there is a saying that, we live in a global village. And so it's kind of like whatever is happening at one point of the globe, within a twinkle of an eye could, spread to the other part. And so I think this spread is not just restricted to the US. It's a global issue. Just because maybe the attention is, more on as far as US is concerned, there are more research and more public outcry about what is going on, and that's why maybe we see a lot of. But in Europe, if you read European Chemical Agency's annual report, they do declare levels of PFAS all over the place. And unfortunately, in areas like developing countries like Africa, where I'm from, there is a lack of reporting for, and conducting productive research to actually establish the levels as could have been done here. And so these are some few challenges which going forward with good research collaborations could help to close in some of these gaps.
So I want to ask, what will you do? What will you do? I know recently we took a trip to the Potamological Institute along the Ohio River to hear the Barbara Crow talk about the Louisville water there. And, it's good to know as much as possible about your drinking water. Another thing that the EPA is looking at, and you're gonna hear more and more about it, is wastewater testing. And, as everybody says, we didn't cause the problem, but what's gonna happen is they're gonna have to look upstream what company is discharging, and that company is going to be held accountable. They're going to have to remove the PFAS, switch to something different, or they're going to have to pay it, not not the wastewater company. So, you know, the blame is going to be put where the blame needs to fall. And, you know, we have to realize that even if it is a firefighter and he's having his uniform washed at work, where does that water go? So the Teflon that's sandwiched inside and the chemicals on the outside and the inside, as all this deteriorates, it goes into the sewer system. And where does that go? It ends up being recycled into drinking water. So, you know, these are potent sources where the chemicals can be removed. And yes, litigation is needed to secure the funds so that these companies can remove these chemicals from our drinking water, so we will be healthier people. And so you won't lose your loved ones, whether they go home after having a baby and have high blood pressure and pass away, you know. And I say you're okay until you're not okay. So, you know, we're all in this together, and I think the awareness is the first step.